My name is Elizabeth. I'm 60 years old, living alone in the house my late husband and I shared for years. He passed away a few years ago, and since then, life has felt quieter and slower. I fill my days with small routines, finding comfort in the familiar corners of this old house. It was a cool afternoon, the kind where you feel the chill in the air just enough to make you want to wrap yourself up in something warm. I was tidying up in the kitchen, humming to myself, when I noticed a small puddle of water near the cupboard under the sink. I bent down, frowning, and found that the pipe underneath had a slow, steady leak. Just a small drip at first, but it was getting worse, leaving a wet, messy spot on the floor. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it wasn't a big deal. I figured I could put a bucket under the pipe for a few days, but after a while, I realized it wasn't going away on its own. So, I finally gave in. I found the number of a local handyman service in the drawer, an old flyer that had been there for years. It seemed like fate, really. I dialed the number, hoping someone could come over that day. A friendly voice answered, and I explained the problem. The man on the other end assured me they'd send someone over right away, mentioning a plumber named Ben who was in the area. He said Ben would be over within the hour. I felt relieved. Finally, I wouldn't have to deal with that annoying leak anymore. While waiting, I decided I'd get ready for a shower. It felt like a good time to relax, especially since I'd spent the whole morning cleaning and organizing the house. I went upstairs to my bathroom, letting the warm steam fill the air as I turned on the shower. I wrapped myself in a thick, fluffy white towel, the kind that feels like a warm hug. It was comforting, soft against my skin. I liked how it felt, just being wrapped up with nothing else underneath. I was still holding onto the towel when I heard a soft knock on the door downstairs. My heart skipped a beat. The plumber was here already. I hadn't expected him to arrive so quickly, and for a moment, I panicked, glancing down at myself in the towel. I hadn't put on anything else yet. I thought about rushing to change, but then I shrugged it off. After all, he was just here to fix the leak. I could handle a quick interaction without too much fuss. So I went downstairs just as I was, wrapped up in my towel, and opened the door. There he was, a tall young man standing on my doorstep. He was probably in his early 30s, with a relaxed, confident look about him. His eyes were bright and friendly, and he had a small, easy smile that made me feel comfortable right away. He wore simple work clothes, a worn pair of jeans, a plain shirt and sturdy boots, with a tool bag slung over one shoulder. "Hi, I'm Ben," he said in a deep, gentle voice, his smile widening as he introduced himself. "Hello, Ben," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Not a problem," he said with a nod. "They told me you had a leak under the sink?" I led him into the kitchen, my bare feet padding softly against the floor, still feeling the warmth of the towel around me. I pointed to the cupboard under the sink, and Ben crouched down, inspecting the pipe. He opened his tool bag, pulling out a wrench and a flashlight, and started working, twisting and adjusting things with skillful hands. As he worked, I stood nearby, leaning against the counter, watching him quietly. I couldn't help but notice how his hands moved, strong and sure, as he tightened and adjusted each part. There was a calm, focused energy about him, and I found myself drawn to it, almost mesmerized. At one point, he looked up, and our eyes met. For a split second, I saw something in his expression, a spark, a hint of surprise, maybe even curiosity. It was as if he hadn't really noticed me before, but now that he had, he couldn't look away. We both froze, staring at each other. I felt my cheeks warm as he took in the sight of me wrapped in nothing but a towel. He seemed unable to speak for a moment, and I found myself feeling both shy and excited. His gaze lingered, taking me in from head to toe, as if he was seeing something beautiful that he hadn't expected. Slowly, he rose from where he had been kneeling, standing just a few steps away from me. I could feel my heart beating faster, and I noticed he was breathing a little more deeply too, as if he were just as affected as I was. The air between us felt charged, filled with something we both understood but didn't dare to name. His eyes lingered on my towel, and his lips parted, as if he wanted to say something but wasn't sure what. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a subtle movement, but enough to reveal a growing bulge in his jeans. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Was he getting hard? From looking at me? The thought made me feel warm all over. Finally, he spoke, his voice a little hoarse. Are you okay, ma'am? The question startled me. What? Your pipes, he said, his eyes searching mine. Do you want me to finish fixing them? I blinked, not understanding. Of course, I said, confused. Why wouldn't I? Because, he began, hesitating. Because I think we're both thinking about something else. I blushed, knowing exactly what he meant. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the desire in his eyes. Maybe, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Then maybe we should do something about it. His words sent a shiver of anticipation through me, and I felt myself gnawed, almost without realizing it. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me. But before I knew it, we were standing close, so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I could feel the roughness of his palms against my cheeks, his fingers lightly stroking my skin. Tell me if you want me to stop, he murmured, his breath warm against my lips. Don't stop, I whispered, tilting my head up to meet his gaze. I reached out, and he did the same, our fingers brushing gently. His touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself leaning into him, unable to stop. Then his hand moved up, softly resting against my cheek. His touch was warm, steady, and I felt myself leaning into it, closing my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, he was gazing at me with a mix of longing and tenderness that made my heart flutter. Without another word, he leaned down, his face close to mine. His lips brushed against mine, soft and gentle, and I felt a rush of warmth spread through me. His kiss was hesitant at first, as if he was afraid of going too far, but I responded, meeting his softness with my own. The kiss deepened, growing more intense, and before long, his arms wrapped around me, holding me close. I felt the towel begin to loosen, slipping slightly, but I didn't care. All that mattered was the warmth of his embrace, the way his lips felt against mine, the way his hands moved to hold me close, steady and safe. The sensation of his mouth on mine was so intoxicating, the heat and smell of him so enticing, the feel of his body pressing against mine was so arousing, I felt as if my knees might give way at any moment. As the kiss grew more passionate, his mouth left mine and trailed along my jaw and then down my neck. His tongue was warm and a wave of longing ran through me. His hands continued to roam my body, his tongue continuing to explore. He moved lower and lower until I felt him kneel, kissing my abdomen. Then his hands tugged gently at the towel, which fell to the floor. I stood there, exposed, my entire body humming with desire. I could barely think, barely breathe, and when his hands gripped my thighs and his tongue began to wash my plate, I nearly screamed. My fingers dug into his shoulders, and my head rolled back. My orgasm built slowly and steadily, and when his mouth found the spot that sent me over the edge, I cried out loudly, gripping his shoulders so hard my knuckles turned white. I rode the waves of pleasure for a long time, feeling like the floor would come crashing up to meet me, but somehow, I managed to remain upright. I stood there, breathing hard and waiting for my senses to return. When they did, I looked down at him and smiled, then reached down to pull him up to me. Our lips met again, and I tasted myself on his mouth. We kissed deeply. I reached down to take his hard lollipop in my hand, stroking it gently and smiling as his breath caught in his throat. We stood there, our mouths and bodies locked together, exploring each other with our hands and tongues. I wanted him desperately, and it was clear he wanted me, but the anticipation was so arousing, it almost took my breath away. At last, I pulled away, smiling up at him and then turning around, placing my palms flat against the smooth surface. When his hands ran along the curves of my hips, I felt a rush of heat between my legs, closing my eyes and waiting for the feeling of him inside me. Finally he rode his horse inside my plate. The sensation was so overwhelming. A small cry escaped me, but it felt so good, I could hardly bear it. My body was on fire, and when his arm slipped around my waist, his hand sliding down between my legs, the feeling was so intense, I was sure I would lose control. I cried out, gripping him so tightly. I could feel his heart pounding, and his breath was hot against the skin of my shoulder. When his arms slipped around my waist, he pulled me against him, holding me tight, the hard length of him sliding deep inside. I could feel the heat of his skin, the pounding of his heart. His fingers gripped my hips, pulling me closer as he drove deeper and harder. When his fingers touched my back, the sound of his voice in my ears, I couldn't hold back any longer. He groaned, and I could feel him pulsing inside me. The moment I heard his voice, the words he spoke in my ear, a feeling like nothing I'd ever known swept over me. It was as if something inside me broke open, and the sensation was so strong and so overwhelming. His arms were around my waist, and he was whispering in my ear. His grip loosened, his hands running down the sides of my thighs, and I turned around, sliding my arms around his neck, pulling his lips to mine. We kissed, our tongues intertwining, tasting, exploring, and the sensation of being close to him like this, it was so powerful, so intense. I could hardly stand it. He pulled out, carried me up, and laid me on the kitchen counter. My legs were still spread, my heels on the edge, and his hard lollipop was pressed between them. He began to move his hips, slowly at first, and then faster. He reached out and grabbed my wrists, holding them above my head, and began to move, hard and fast. I cried out, my hips rising to meet him. His body was slick with sweat, his muscles taut, and when he came, his hips bucked, his grip on my wrists tightening. When the moment finally passed, he collapsed against me, his chest pressed against mine. I clung to him, my arms and legs wrapped around him, my head buried in his shoulder. "Wow," he said, his voice low and quiet. I could only nod, my chest rising and falling with every breath. Neither of us said a word as he helped me off the counter, but I could feel the unspoken understanding between us, a promise that this was only the beginning. After a long rest, he reached down to pick up the towels from the floor. "I'm glad you enjoyed yourself," he replied, handing me the towel. "So did I." I laughed, then wrapped the towel around myself. "I'm going to take a shower," I said, reaching out to run a finger along his cheek. "All right," he replied, then gave me a wink. I headed for the bedroom, unable to stop the smile from spreading across my face. After we were done cleaning up, Ben finished fixing the pipe, and he promised to come by and check on the pipe in a few days. Then he left, leaving me feeling more alive and awake than I'd ever felt before. I spent the rest of the evening floating on air, reliving those moments in my mind. I couldn't believe it had actually happened, that something so intense and intimate had just taken place. And the funny thing was, I hadn't even asked him for his number. It hadn't seemed necessary. We both knew we'd see each other again. The next morning, as I went about my day, I couldn't shake the feeling of Ben's touch or the memory of our kiss. It was like a warmth that lingered in my heart, lighting up even the simplest moments. I kept replaying it all in my mind, the way he had looked at me, his hands, his soft lips against mine. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time, and it filled me with a kind of joy and excitement I hadn't expected. Days went by, and I figured that maybe that magical evening was a one-time thing. I didn't know if I would see Ben again. Maybe it was best to leave it as a beautiful memory and let it go. But a small part of me, deep down, hoped that he would come back, even if I had no reason to believe he would. And then one quiet afternoon, I heard a knock on the door. I opened it, and there he was, Ben, standing on my doorstep, looking a little shy but smiling that same warm smile that had charmed me the first time. "Hi," he said softly, his eyes bright with something I recognized all too well. "Ben," I replied, feeling my heart beat a little faster. "What brings you here?" "Well, I was in the area, and I wanted to check on that leak. Make sure everything's working right," he said, his smile growing a little sheepish. It was a thin excuse, and we both knew it, but I was more than happy to play along. "Oh, of course. Come in, please," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He walked into the kitchen, and we both knew he didn't need to look under the sink. The leak was fixed, just as he'd promised. Instead, he turned to me, his gaze soft, filled with a quiet intensity that I could feel in my bones. There was no pretending anymore. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, letting the silence speak for us. Then, as if on cue, he stepped closer, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was warm, familiar now, and I felt that same rush from the first time we met. It was as if the days that had passed since our last encounter had only deepened our connection, making it even harder to resist. He lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to my knuckles, and I felt my cheeks flush. There was a tenderness in his actions that took my breath away, and I found myself smiling, feeling like a girl half my age. It was strange, this unexpected affection from someone so much younger, but it felt natural, as though we were meant to find each other in this quiet corner of life. Ben looked at me, his eyes full of kindness and something more, a longing, a desire that mirrored my own. Without another word, he leaned down, and our lips met again, soft and gentle at first, but growing deeper, more urgent. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and I could feel the strength of his embrace, his heartbeat against mine. As we stood there, wrapped up in each other's arms, I felt a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. It was like stepping into a world where time didn't exist, where there were no worries or doubts, only the warmth of his touch, the comfort of his presence. After a while, we pulled back, both of us a little breathless, smiling shyly at each other. He stroked my cheek with his thumb, his touch gentle, and for a moment, we just stood there, enjoying the silence, the closeness. It was a kind of intimacy that didn't need words, a connection that spoke louder than any conversation ever could. From that day on, Ben would stop by every now and then. Sometimes he'd come up with small excuses, like checking the pipes or looking at a loose cabinet door. Other times, he'd just knock on my door, no explanations, and I'd welcome him in, my heart racing with excitement each time. We spent many afternoons together, sharing quiet moments, laughing at little things, and just enjoying each other's company. There was something so easy, so natural about being with him. He made me feel alive, as though I'd discovered a part of myself I'd forgotten. One evening, as the sun set and the room filled with a warm golden glow, we sat together on the couch, my head resting on his shoulder. He stroked my hair, his touch tender, and I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. "You know," he murmured softly, "I didn't expect this with you." "Neither did I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm glad it happened." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with affection, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling of belonging that I hadn't known I was missing. We sat there in silence, just enjoying the closeness, the comfort of being together. Over time, our connection only grew stronger. Ben became more than just a visitor. He became a part of my life, someone I looked forward to seeing, someone who brought light and laughter into my days. We shared quiet mornings, lazy afternoons, and countless whispered secrets, building a bond that went beyond words. There were days when we'd take long walks, holding hands, talking about everything and nothing. He'd tell me stories about his work, his dreams, and I'd share pieces of my own life, memories from years gone by. We laughed, we talked, and sometimes, we'd simply sit in silence, content just to be together. Our time together was unexpected, a beautiful surprise that had come into my life when I least expected it. Ben reminded me of the joy of being close to someone, of the thrill of discovering a connection that went beyond age, beyond expectations. He was like a spark that had reignited a warmth in my heart, a reminder that life still held surprises, that love could come in the most unexpected ways. And as the days turned into weeks, I knew that this bond we shared was something special, something rare. It wasn't about the future, or about making promises. It was about the present, about the joy of being with someone who made me feel truly alive. In those quiet moments with him, I realized that life is full of surprises, and sometimes, the most beautiful things come when you least expect them. And as we held each other close, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that I had found something precious, something that would stay with me, a memory to cherish, no matter what the future held.